about the conspiracy consumers? Who are these people who are consuming these conspiracy theories and taking them seriously? Well, psychologists say that you can explain some of this at the individual level with this idea of a conspiracy mentality. So some people, psychologists argue, have a conspiracy mentality, which is a personality trait that disposes people to believe in conspiracy theories. So it's just like any other personality trait. So psychologists who do in personality psychology, talk about the big five, which is openness to experience, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, neuroticism. And the idea is these are personality traits that are largely heritable. At least 50% of the variance seems to be just inherited from your parents, is the idea. So how open you are, how agreeable you are, how neurotic you are, these are sort of things that are due to either your genetic inheritance or your early childhood environment, and you can't really change them. They're just sort of part of your psychological makeup. And the psychologists are saying something similar about the conspiracy mentality. Some people are just kind of gullible, and they have this natural disposition to believe these sorts of things. And we should think of them as kind of being victims of conspiracy theories, because in a way they can't help themselves. It's just the kind of personality that they have. Now, Cassam is saying something different. He's saying, well, there might be some people who have a conspiracy mentality that makes them more prone to these things. But what I'm interested in are epistemic vices that also seem to be playing a role here. Now, an epistemic vice, as I said earlier, is a trait of the mind that leads you to tend to form false beliefs, and it's a reprehensible trait. It's one for which you are in some sense blameworthy. Okay, so an epistemic vice is a character trait or attitude of thinking or styles of thought that systematically, though not invariably, get in the way of knowledge. So why not invariably? Well, let's say you're really gullible. Gullibility is an epistemic vice. It means that you just take whatever people tell you that is true as if it's true, and you don't think about it any further. That's not always going to lead you to form false beliefs, because somebody might just tell you some information that's true, right, in a straightforward way, and you'll just take it on board, so you'll have a true belief. But the idea is systematically you tend to form false beliefs when you're gullible, because you'll believe anything people tell you, and people aren't always going to be giving you good information. So Cassam is saying some of the epistemic vices that seem to be at work in conspiracy theories are things like wishful thinking. So wishful thinking, he says, is an epistemically vicious style of thinking in which a thinker's desires have a greater influence than logic or any evidential considerations. So what's the wishful thinking that's at play in someone believing a conspiracy theory? Why would somebody want to believe, for example, that the gunman who went in at the Sandy Hook massacre didn't actually do that and all those people were paid actors? Well, think about it. Think about the world that we're living in. We're living in a world where young, disturbed people could get access to military-grade weapons and walk into an elementary school and start shooting people. Who wants to live in a world like that? Wouldn't you rather live in a world where that didn't really happen and the whole thing was just a conspiracy? So that's one way to think about the role that wishful thinking might be playing here. People don't want to believe that they live in a world where these terrible things happen. Rather, let's believe in a world where there are good forces and evil forces, but the evil forces, they aren't doing anything like that. They're not walking in a meaningless, absurd way, shooting children. No, they have this evil agenda that they want to execute, but the good guys are going to beat them. You know, the good guys who have their guns in their house are going to go out into the streets and put a stop to this evil empire. Okay, so that's wishful thinking. Cassam also says that some of the epistemic vices at play in people believing conspiracy theories are character traits, like gullibility, which I mentioned earlier. Gullibility is just a tendency to take whatever people tell you and to believe it. So gullible people will be more susceptible to conspiracy theories online. Someone will post a meme on Facebook, and they'll see it, and they'll say, oh, wow, I can't believe it. I can't believe Hillary Clinton is running a sex dungeon in a pizzeria in Washington, D.C. Must be true, though, because my friend told me it's true. So that's obviously a crude description of how the gullible mind works. but it's also kind of a true description of how a gullible mind works. Gullible people take on information as if it's true when they have no good reason to believe it. Another epistemic vice that seems to be at work in conspiracy theories is what Cassam calls epistemic insouciance. Epistemic insouciance, if you have that kind of attitude towards knowledge, you have an attitude where you don't care one way or another about the truth. So an epistemically insouciant agent is someone who will pass information along, for example, with no concern whatsoever for whether or not what they're saying is true, or whether or not there's any evidence for it. And that kind of intellectual apathy does seem to play a really big role in amplifying conspiracy theories online. Because again, people get a meme on Facebook, it suggests that some wild, outlandish thing is true, and instead of investigating it and just spending a few minutes looking into whether or not it is true, people amplify it and suggest that they just pass it on as if it is true. We don't know how much of a role epistemic vices play in the tendency to endorse conspiracy theories. We don't know how much of it, for example, is just people having a conspiracy mentality as opposed to people having these epistemic traits that they can actually control and do something about if they wanted to. But we can be confident that they do play a role. And vice epistemology studies that. Epistemology that's interested in the vices of the mind, these things that tend to systematically lead us to endorse false beliefs. And it's a really interesting area of study. So it's a pure branch of philosophy, which is just interested in what makes an excellent knower. And people working in this area of philosophy do a lot of interdisciplinary work with psychologists and trying to study the actual extent to which different epistemic vices are playing a role in things like people believing conspiracy theories. So an interesting question in the background of all of this is the extent to which people are responsible or blameworthy for their epistemic vices. So Cassam is saying, what makes a vice is that it's reprehensible. So Cassam was someone who says, look, if you have a mental defect that you can do nothing about, that's not an epistemic vice. You're not blameworthy for that. You're not reprehensible for that. An epistemic vice is something that you can do something about. But you might ask, can you really do something about being gullible? Isn't gullibility just a trait of the mind? Or can you really do something about the fact that you're epistemically insouciant? If you don't care about the truth, doesn't the fact that you don't care about the truth mean that you're precisely not going to be able to make yourself care about it? Right? So the extent to which we can actually be responsible for these things is an interesting question. Cassam has a whole chapter on it. You can read that if you want to. I'm happy to talk to you about it. Another interesting question to ask, though, is does the notion of an epistemic vice over-personalize the problem at hand? Are there not better social explanations for these phenomena that we need to take a closer look at? And that's what we're going to take a look at in the next video.